Jason Bentley, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So it's funny, I know you've been doing radio for a long time, so you're probably going to out host me on this maybe a little bit.
Yeah, I came up and radio was sort of my dream. Since I was a child. Actually, I'm one of those rare cases where, even as a young kid, I had a make believe, mock radio station in my bedroom, and I would record songs and record my voice onto a cassette deck. And so, yeah, it was the great dream of mine.
Yeah, so you've been doing this. Some kids are playing rock star, some kids are playing football, but you were pretending to be a radio host, and way to manifest it, huh?
Yeah, I've had the great opportunity of working at KCRW, which, as a public radio station in LA, is sort of as an outsized influence. It's sort of the little engine that could over the years. Mostly being in Los Angeles, this is such a key media market, and is just influential when you think about who our audience is. Typically, since public radio is the the outlet of choice for the creative class typically. So you're reaching writers and directors and actors and all these people that can kind of share the ideas that you're putting forward through a music mix many times, and relay that to a much wider group.
Yeah, for those who don't live in Los Angeles, KCRW, like you said, it's huge among creatives and just people who, maybe not as much of the mainstream radio, but who are music lovers. And it's also, I don't know the proper radio term for it, but you guys are pushing out the NPR content on there as well. So it's a huge station in Los Angeles, I'd say, for young adults, and probably older adults too. You guys got great news on there and everything. One of my favorite news sources. So how old were you when you started, messing around thinking it would be cool to be a radio host? And was there anyone in particular that influenced that?
Well, my first opportunity in radio came with college radio. The nice thing about college radio is you're welcome to be involved just like any other club or organization on campus. You can kind of walk in and find like-minded souls who have similar interests in music, and so that's exactly what happened. And getting involved in radio at college was sort of, at that time, I feel like it was the golden age of college radio, with bands like Nirvana and it was sort of the grunge rock movement. My particular interest and obsession was the electronic music explosion in the 90s that became my youth culture movement. So I represented that on the radio, and I also did a lot out, in the scene itself in Los Angeles, whether it was, kind of throwing illicit parties and late night warehouse parties, or DJing all over. It was just something I got completely immersed in. And so that kind of first explosion globally of electronic music, and maybe what some can describe now as EDM, was really at that time in the early 90s.
Yeah, I remember LA was such a hub for that whole scene. And I remember, there were a lot of those warehouse parties or kind of, abandoned building parties. And then also, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like LA was one of the first cities to really have those massive things. They're so typical now. You see them in Vegas all the time, I think, because they got outlawed in Los Angeles eventually. But they did, right? Maybe like 5 years ago, like the kind of the massive raves were basically outlawed.
Yeah, they still go on, but one of the most influential and the largest in the country, which is EDC, Electric Daisy Carnival, began in Los Angeles, and I actually played the first one over 20 years ago. Now wow. It's at a massive scale in Las Vegas every year. Los Angeles was a beacon, has always been a beacon for electronic music. I think there's something about the sort of the spirit of the West Coast, that sort of free spirit, and it just kind of matched perfectly with the promise of electronic music and that sort of liberated feeling of dancing all night. And so yeah, I mean, besides Europe, Europe was really the catalyst, England and different parts of Europe. But in America, it was huge in LA, San Francisco. Ironically, the roots of all of it go back to Chicago and Detroit. And really, as disco flamed out and became saturated in pop culture, there was a pushback, and disco went back underground and sort of reimagined itself as house music and as electronic music. So all those influential disco records, whether it was the soulful side lyrically or the strange electronic side like I Feel Love by Donna Summer, this sort of got reconstituted and reemerged really through electronic music, Detroit, Chicago, but it was really England that picked it up. And just in the same way that England picked up American blues music and fed it back to us as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and that's when it became mainstream. It's the same sort of cyclical pattern that we experience with dance music in the States.
Yeah, you're totally right. As soon as I said, LA was one of the first big scenes, I was like, oh well, except for Europe, of course, because they love their EDM over there.
Yeah, they're just great collectors. The colonists of the world. They love taking and co-opting culture from other parts of the globe.
I do love that you brought it back to the States though, and credit disco, and Chicago and Detroit. So it's nice to know that the roots are still in America. So
of course,
sorry Europe, but no, love disco and love the EDM, and that's amazing. You were at the first EDC. What a thing to have on your resume. So you were doing college radio, but you said even as a kid you were kind of playing DJ, right?
Yeah, I grew up in Boston, and there were some great radio stations there, Kiss 108 and WBCN, and I love the DJs. I think what I was drawn to with radio is that it's kind of theater of the imagination. Unlike video as a medium, radio allows you to create the picture and the narrative a little more. And so I just loved these voices coming out of the radio. Much later, when I was in my late teens, when I stumbled across NPR and their sense of imagination for radio drama, things like that. There were a few pivotal figures at KCRW that completely blew my mind, and I just wanted to gravitate to that. So I had those influences, but they were at KCRW, and that's what really led me to that station.
Wow, that's cool. Was your dad or your mom or any siblings, were they into radio? Did you kind of pick that up for somebody, or were they just playing in the car and you're like, hey, I like this?
Not really. It was just my own thing. Parents had great record collections, but that's about it. I did enjoy the ritual of going to record stores like every weekend with my dad. We had that thing where also part of it was showing off your take after and it was always about music discovery. It was like, oh, I found this one and check this out, and we'd sort of share what we had both found in the record stacks. Man, I wish that young people today could have that same experience, and maybe part of the reasons why I have all these records. And what you don't see is that these records go on all the walls around us too. So there's a lot. There's about 20,000 pieces of vinyl. It probably all traces back to going with my dad to record stores.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, nothing beats that. Just cruising to the record store, finding something, the joy of being like, oh, I found something good, or talking to the people there and getting some recommendations. But at the same time, I do love that I can listen to any song I want. And like I tell some of my friends, I listen to more music now than I ever have, because I can literally just you know, listen to a million different tracks, preview a million tracks. So of course, you know, technology has its ups and downs, but I love what you said about Britain feeding us back our own music. I like I like the idea of them kind of laundering our genres and then putting it back in front of us and making it feel new a little bit, just with that little bit of accent or whatever they do. Because I've always loved British rock. But you know, it's important to remember that it, you know, blues and rock and roll did start here.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it does speak to a certain degree of you know, institutional racism and prejudice, because if it's coming back to us through these, you know, cute pop stars, even if they're covering an American blues artist, a Black American artist, it's more safe, it's more palatable and acceptable that way. And it's just, you know, it's unfortunate that it has to happen that way ultimately.
Sure, yeah, and then we saw that happening even, you know, even before the Beatles. You know, Elvis was the king of kind of you know, he Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog was Big Mama Thornton's song, but no one, you know, very few people realized that. And of course, just all that whole blues rock and roll style was, you know, created by African Americans. So
Yeah,
so yeah.
and, you know, it's same when we're talking about electronic music. We're talking about, you know, Chicago and Detroit. We're talking about, you know, Black American musicians in the underground who are exploring new territory that gets ultimately co-opted by, you know, white musicians and audiences. But you know, this is something that we are continuing to reconcile to this day. I mean, you know, we've had quite a year in 2020. I think one thing that, you know, the pandemic and COVID, you know, as a virus, it sort of it lays bare pre-existing conditions, and so similarly, I think the pandemic has shown us some pre-existing conditions that we have to work on.
Yeah, it's I live in Highland Park, and I was just taking a walk the other day, and I saw a huge mural, and it said, "America, your check engine light is on." I thought that was a clever way of putting it.
Great.
But so I mean, that's awesome. You loved KCRW before you even started working there, and then for, you know, what was it, nearly a decade, you were the host of Morning Becomes Eclectic, which is, you know, such a staple, I think, for Los Angeles commuters. So is it an interesting life, you know, having a lot of people know your name and your voice, but without the visual media, maybe a lot less people actually recognize your face? How is that going through life like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange degree of celebrity. You know, I've been recognized by my voice in some pretty far-flung places. Like one time I was talking to concierge at a hotel in Istanbul in Turkey, and a couple behind me said, "Wait a second, are you Jason Bentley? We recognized your voice. We're from LA." It's crazy.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a strange sort of, you know, BC level celebrity status. But you know, I would compare it to local broadcasters that are beloved. You know, like your favorite weather guy or your, you know, favorite news anchor. It's that kind of thing. And you know, I realized that just like those figures in media, they have an incredible longevity in their position. You know, like they basically keep going in that capacity until they can't do it anymore. And that's unique in media. A lot of times there's more turnover, but in local news and broadcasting, people have incredible longevity. So I obviously could have continued at KCRW, but I just really felt like I did it to death. You know, there just wasn't anything else to do there. And you know, I wanted to explore other things. I wanted to have a family before that was too late. I now have twin boys. They're just 3 months old now.
Nice,
So,
congrats.
thank you. So, you know, there are some important boxes that I needed to turn my attention to, you know, checking. And for whatever reason, I couldn't do those things with the schedule and the pace and the requirements of being music director and a daily music show host. I really approached that all in. You know, I gave KCRW no regrets, but I gave it everything that I had, and almost took like a military kind of attitude, you know, where, and I kept my hair cropped short, like it was just like, you know, and now, you know, I'm just like looking like a crazy scientist. But
Well, you're not alone in 2020 with the haircut, you know.
yeah, the pandemic here.
Yeah.
But you know, I think, long story short, you know, I really gave everything of myself to that job, because it just required it and it deserved it. And it was a wonderful, wonderful thing that opened me up to so much music. And you know, we did live sessions and interviews with 3 different artists on the average each week, and just kept that pace. And so you're constantly interacting with interesting people you admire, musicians that you love. And so it was a, you know, it was a special job. But I just came to a point where it's like, you know what, I have to shake things up. I need to do things differently in order to fulfill some other interests I have.
Sure. I think, you know, as awesome as it was, you know, you got a good decade out of it. I mean, I think that's solid. And I have thought about that before, you know, more in terms of talk show hosts on that I see on TV, but you know, similar with you with a daily show. That, you know, how cool of a job that is, you know, to be interviewing all these people every day, but at the same time it seems that it would be highly restrictive to your schedule, because you've got to be there and every single day to do that daily, you know, show.
Yeah, and also, you know, I think you kind of get into patterns and habits, and that's the way that we're able to execute at a high level, day in, day out. But unless you challenge your mind to work out different ways of thinking about things, then you know, you never know what your capacity is. That's something that I appreciate about the Backstory podcast that I'm doing, working with Soho House and One-on-One Studios. This is not music related specifically. It's really just about interesting guests from different areas. So it's really pulled me out of my comfort zone. And also, they're not necessarily familiar with me directly through the radio, the way that artists would come to the radio station and they would know exactly who I was and what I do for them, and they would appreciate it and say, "Hey, thank you for playing the records." But you know, with these guests, you know, they're not so familiar, and so it's been a challenge. And also, the format is different, where it's 2 guests from disparate backgrounds, and so that really adds a layer of difficulty in kind of moderating the conversation, finding the common ground between the 2 guests. It also adds difficulty to the booking, because you want to make sure when you're booking people that they have some comfort level in even getting to this table, this virtual table. And so it's just been harder on a few different levels, but worth it.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely adds a layer of interest. And I've been, for example, it's James Corden. You know, he kind of brought that British style. I'm forgetting the name of the British talk show that I think was maybe one of his inspirations. But he's this talk show host, and he usually has like 3 or 4 guests on at the same time.
Maybe Graham Norton.
Yeah, Graham Norton.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I've always loved seeing, you know, the dynamics of 2 people interacting, you know, like Liam Gallagher interacting with, you know, Jamie Foxx or something, you know. I always thought that was cool. So bringing it to the podcast format, I think is an awesome idea. And you've had, you know, some pretty incredible booking already. Kristen Bell, Adam Grant, Kevin Costner, Margaret Cho, Paul Feig. Is it Feige or Feig?
I think it's Feig.
Feig. Okay.
That's how I said it when I was with him.
Yeah. Yeah. He's, you know, director of Bridesmaids and Ghostbusters. I just rewatched Bridesmaids the other day, and still hilarious. So
Yeah.
you've had some incredible guests booked already. How's it been so far?
It's been great, and I'm really committed to the process and researching and kind of respecting our guests by doing all the homework. You know, not looking to cut corners or use, you know, old crutches that, interviewers can, you certainly have those tools if they're needed.
Sure.
But for instance, the next one coming up is the pair is Terrence Blanchard, who is a jazz musician. He's a trumpeter. He's an educator. He's Spike Lee's go-to film composer for more than 30 different films over the years.
Wow.
And he's also written an opera that will be the opening opera at the Met in New York their next season, so post-pandemic opening of their season. So really interesting dude. And then he's paired with a guy named Kemp Powers, who's a playwright and co-directed a new Pixar film called Soul. He also wrote a play which has been adapted into a film called One Night in Miami, directed by Regina King, the actress. And interesting people. And, also, discussing their latest projects with, America 2020, the election, everything that can go into this conversation, and just sort of managing my ideas and then sort of trying to moderate the flow between the two of them in, how they can both really contribute, and also encouraging them to interact, because the idea of this podcast is for it to be a conversation over drinks or at lunch. The idea originally was to do it in person. The pandemic changed the whole equation, but the idea was to have the conversation at a table at Soho House, and everything that is included in terms of the auditory experience. So the buzz in the room, the waiter coming to the table,
the clanging of the glasses, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that's something that really excited me when we were first talking about the podcast, was the immersive audio experience. We're making the best of the situation, and it's been fine. But anyway, the idea of it being a conversation where it's not the traditional role so much of like interviewer, interviewee, wait for the question. I really want to encourage them to talk amongst themselves as much, or even ask me questions. So,
yeah, it must be interesting, interviewing so many artists on this podcast. I definitely find commonalities. So many of the artists I talk to will give similar advice. So it makes me think, hey, this must be true. Are you finding any interesting commonalities between these cross sections of kind of high performing, not so typical job, career people who are in these not so typical careers? Are you finding any interesting commonalities between them and their inspirations?
Totally. I mean, that's really where it gets interesting on the podcast. Paul Feig and Margaret Cho were my guests on the last episode, and talking to them about their inspirations and finding the value in collaboration was really cool. Also, just representing the ways that they each represent marginalized communities is sort of part of their mission, but they go about it in very different ways, even though I think the ultimate goal is similar. Margaret Cho is someone who gets up on stage as a comedian and will make you laugh and make you cringe and make you uncomfortable and be a little bit controversial and shocking. Where Paul Feig is, taking familiar formats and tweaking them and, kind of reimagining them. He talks about his movie Spy. He's had a great run of collaboration with Melissa McCarthy, several films, but even Ghostbusters is another example. He'll take an idea and a format and sort of a brand that we're very familiar with, but he'll reinvent it. And by doing that, he will advance the interests of a marginalized community. And so, it's interesting to see that they have similar goals, but just very different ways of going about it.
Right. So along with the podcast, you're also a music supervisor for Top Gun Maverick, motion picture soundtrack. And, you've done some incredible soundtracks, TRON, Legacy, the newer one, The Matrix. How is that? Is that fun? I feel like being a music director for or supervisor for these things would be fun. I mean, of course it's work. You got to sift through probably endless amounts of music, but you know, as far as the job goes, that there's a lot worse things than sifting through tons of music to go with certain scenes. And can you tell us a little bit about how it is doing that?
Well, you know, for me, it was a natural extension of DJing. I mean, with DJing, whether you're in a club, festival, or on the radio, you're sort of trying to play the perfect song for people in order
Right.
for someone to sort of connect in the moment. The most powerful work I do at radio is when I'm able to reflect an actual event in the world, whether it's political or social, or it could be even the weather. You know, like there's something that's very powerful about opening on a rainy day in Los Angeles, which doesn't happen often, when there's a rainstorm in LA and you play Riders on the Storm from the Doors as your opening song at 9 a.m., you wouldn't believe the feedback, the connection, the sort of power that that moment has, where everyone gets on the same wavelength at the same time. So I think that's sort of the goal. And it's similar with music supervision, is you're trying to serve the story, of course, but when you make that connection for the audience with the perfect song choice, everyone locks on. It just elevates the whole experience. But I don't want to oversimplify that process because there's so much that goes into it. Um, Ideally, you're working with a director one-to-one on their unified vision, but more often you have to work with the director plus the studio plus the producer or producers
Mm.
plus opinions from far corners of the office. I mean, I've been on projects where I did a director's cut, thought everything was great, that was rejected by the producer. Director leaves the project and I'm left basically peddling my ideas to the producer and their office. You know, like it's like they have a trusted group. They're like, okay, tell us all your ideas. This includes the receptionist. I'm like, what happened? And also similar on Top Gun. Actually, I worked on Top Gun for a year and a half, and this film, like a lot of projects, got rescheduled for next year. But it would not surprise me. I can in fact assure you that all of the work that we did on that will get reinvented, reimagined, and replaced ultimately before it actually screens. The thing about music is it's one thing in the movies that can change fairly late in the process. It's not uncommon for a film to be test screened and maybe it gets a tepid response and then they'll throw the score out because that's one thing that they can do. You know,
Mm.
it's hard to reshoot or, recast somebody. You can't do that, but you can change the score. So anyway, all I'm saying is that it's really tricky and can be very difficult. Um, there's tremendous reward at times, and I can look at things in Tron or the Matrix that are personally very rewarding because you feel like you nailed it.
Yeah.
But there's so many other challenges. I mean, not to mention, you might pitch a song and then that song isn't available. Either it's a budget thing or the artist will just decline the use. So there's things out of your control. So I know people would like to think like, oh yeah, music supervision, I could do that. That sounds fun. It can be a real grind and really frustrating at the same time. So beware.
Sure, sure. No, I can imagine that. And that's very interesting that you mentioned that's one of the easier things to modify if the film doesn't feel right for whatever after the fact. So um one thing I did want to mention though is, as an EDM fan growing up and being part of the scene, and then you being part of the Tron Legacy soundtrack, linking up Daft Punk with that soundtrack seemed like such an epic combination of visual and kind of the perfect the perfect artist to go along with that. And like you said, you probably felt like you nailed that. How was it? How could you tell us
Yeah.
a little bit about how that came to be and maybe the thought process that went through that?
Yeah. Also that's another example where, I'm glad you feel like we nailed it, but it was really difficult. I mean, Daft Punk are very particular about their artistic decisions. You notice how they didn't even tour on the back of their Grammy award-winning album Random Access Memories. They're an unusual duo, and so getting them to sign on was a pretty elaborate process. Was not easy. I know they were interested, but we still had to present the right opportunity and set the table for them, which included, first taking them around to meet several top composers in Hollywood. The studio, Disney, wanted a bit of an insurance policy since Daft Punk hadn't done a score at this level ever before. And so they thought, well, maybe they could, co-write it, co-produce it with a, John Powell or Hans Zimmer or somebody like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went around to these meetings, and at the end of it, after 2 weeks of meetings, I said, all right, guys, well, Disney is really wondering, what's the decision here? Who do you want to work with? And they said to me, we want to do it ourselves. We want to build the studio around us like what we've seen these guys have. And we want to put in the work, and we want to learn from it, and just we'll dedicate a year or more to this process and won't do anything else. We'll move to LA. And so that was probably the biggest challenge, was setting the table for them. We set up a studio for them at the Henson lot, the old A&M studios on La Brea in Hollywood. Got them a workspace and long-term, moved them out here, and also surrounded them with a team, orchestrator, a music editor, pieces of the puzzle that are normal. And then, convincing the studio also that this was a good idea, because of course they loved the idea of someone being with them to
Sure.
quarterback this process. But they did a great job. And to their credit, they dedicated their energy and focus to this exclusively to make it happen.
Yeah, well done. I mean, I think fans of Daft Punk and just seeing the visuals in Tron, you were like, of course, this makes perfect sense, and props to you guys for nailing down some notoriously hard to nail down artists. You probably know this being in the music scene, but it's kind of like a running joke that Daft Punk is playing at Coachella or whatever, because they just never do, and so I could see them being picky, and that being a hurdle that you'd have to get over. Well, Jason, man, it's been a real pleasure. You've had an incredible career. We'll be listening to the backstory, your new podcast, for all those interesting interactions with those great guests. And aside from that, you're working on Top Gun. You've done all this great, music supervisor work. You still got your Metropolis show on Saturday on KCRW, so we can still hear you on the radio that way, listening to your tunes there. But you've DJ'd, all these great things. You just, you told me you did the first EDC. You've done Academy Awards, after parties for the Governors Ball and Coachella.
Yep.
So I guess, with all that, we usually like to ask artists, if you had one piece of advice for aspiring artists, what would it be? And you are an artist of sorts, because you are doing all these different creative processes. So I think I can just pose the same question to you. If you had one piece of advice for people who are aspiring in the creative field, what would it be?
Wow. Well, I think, we all struggle with the rub of, art versus commerce, or, your passion versus the realities of your day to day. And I would just encourage people to stick with that spark, and sometimes you really have to defend it and protect it and push back on people or forces that are doubting you. I would just say, believe in every little shred of creativity you have, whatever it is. If it's unique to you and you want to bestow that sort of magic on something, just don't let it go. Don't let, and it's hard, it's a fight constantly, because, hey, you got, you've got to make ends meet, and there's COVID, and I mean, a million things, and that's life. But ultimately, you've really got to protect that flame and that spark in your life, and whatever it is. And probably for your audience, it's music related. Certainly is for me. And so just hold on to it. Don't let it go, no matter what.
Yeah, I love how, when you keep pursuing things like you're doing EDM shows one day, and then all of a sudden you are met with the opportunity to hire Daft Punk to do a Disney movie of of epic proportion. I love how if you just keep pursuing, your interests can cross each other in very interesting ways if you just keep pushing it, like you said. Bring it back.